Hello, and welcome to our panel discussion on the Laramie Project by Moises Kaufman and members of the Tectonic Theater Project. I'm your moderator, Eric Morgan. I'm an associate professor in the Democracy and Justice and History programs at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Joining me today are Rebecca Stone Thornberry, director and assistant professor in the Theater and Dance Department, McKenzie Thompson, dramaturg and UWGB student majoring in technical theater and psychology, and Kylie Heisz, actor and also UWGB student majoring in performance and communications. Thank you all so much for being with me here today. I'd like to begin with a little historical background, and then we'll get into our conversation. On the night of October 6th, 1998, Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old student studying political science at the University of Wyoming, was robbed, beaten, tortured, and left to die outside the city of Laramie. Shepard was a gay man, and in the wake of his death, many observers denounced the brutal attack and murder as a hate crime due to Shepard's sexuality. Shepard's attackers, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, were tried and convicted of murder, with each receiving 2 consecutive life sentences. While the alleged homophobic motives behind the attack and murder remain contested, Shepard's death brought national attention to both homophobia and hate crimes. In October of 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Shepard-Byrd Act into law, which expanded federal hate crime protections to include a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. A decade later, in 2000, the Laramie Project premiered in Denver, Colorado. It was written by Moises Kaufman, a Venezuelan director, filmmaker, playwright, and founder of the Tectonic Theater Project, along with numerous other members of the theater group. The Tectonic Theater Project, based in New York City, was founded in 1991 and focuses on creating dialogues with audiences on a wide variety of social, political, and human issues. I'd like for us to begin by digging a bit deeper into the historical context and importance of both Matthew Shepard's story and the Laramie Project. Rebecca, could you tell us a bit more about why Matthew Shepard's murder was so important in the larger context of the LGBTQ rights movement at the time?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that is important to know about Matthew Shepard is that he became an icon for LGBTQ advocacy after his death. He became really important in the movement. His parents, Judy and Dennis Shepard, created the Matthew Shepard Foundation and have been very vocal in talking about LGBTQ issues and supporting legislation that is pro-LGBTQ, and have really pushed for more understanding and acceptance after what happened to their son. So they've been very instrumental. And then the movement as a whole, Matthew's death really brought to light something I think the country couldn't ignore. And there was a lot of debate at the time and in the town of Laramie about whether this was a hate crime, whether this was just a murder. There was some rewriting of history where if the Tectonic Theater Company went back to Laramie 10 years later to write a second play, and they found that there were people who were very adamant that this wasn't a hate crime, it was about drugs, it was a robbery. So there's been some rewriting of history in that way, but for the LGBTQ community in particular, Shepard became an iconic figure around which a lot of advocacy was centered. And as you mentioned, the Shepard-Byrd bill in 2009 was a hate crimes bill that was signed into law by Barack Obama, and Judy and Dennis Shepard were particularly important in the fight for that particular legislation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's turn to the Laramie Project itself. After its premiere, during its run, what was the critical and popular reception of the show? And kind of thinking in terms of broad terms, I am a historian, so I like to think about, influence, legacy. How would you describe the Laramie Project's importance and influence in the history of modern theater?
I think it's been very important. At the time, it was received very well. the members of the company, after they went to Laramie, and they developed the play, they had a lot of material. They had to cut out a number of things that they were developing because things just kept, it's already a 2.5-hour play, and it was getting longer and longer and longer because they had so many interviews. So they kept whittling away at it, formed it down into a more manageable size play, premiered it at the Denver Center, and then came back to New York, where they did it off Broadway in 2000. And it really took New York by storm. I think it got a lot of very positive critical reception. It was a popular show. It was something that audiences were very interested in seeing. I was in New York at the time that it premiered off Broadway, and was able to see it. And it was really just a powerful piece of theater. There were also demonstrations in New York City around Matthew Shepard's death. So it was coming at a very critical time. It was relatively recently after his death that it premiered in New York. So I think it was very well received.
Wonderful. So you mentioned briefly, and I aired earlier. I said 10 years later, but the act came 10 years later, but the play was 2 years after his death. But you mentioned just a moment ago the fact that the play was composed of interviews. So very much like Twilight, the last production that the theater program put on, which was wonderful. The Laramie Project is also an excellent example of verbatim theater. For those in our audience who are not familiar with this kind of playwriting and theater, could you tell us a little bit more about what that is and why the Tectonic Theater Project chose this unique approach to tell this particular story?
Sure. Verbatim theater comes from interviews. They chose to go back to Laramie and talk to people and use their actual words in creating the play. So everything that you hear in the text of the play is something that someone said in Laramie to them when they were conducting these interviews over a period of quite a long period of time. And they went back, I think, 6 times and conducted over 200 interviews. So these are the words spoken by the people of the town. Now, interestingly enough, once the people of the town heard their own words reflected back to them, sometimes they didn't like what they heard, but those were the actual words that they said at the time. So I think verbatim theater can be very powerful in adding multiple voices into the conversation. We have voices from the gay community in and around Laramie. We have voices from the religious leaders in Laramie, common people in Laramie, people who are ranchers and older people, younger people. We get all these different voices. So it's really polyvocal in that way. And we hear from just a lot of people. And the company members, they're not journalists, they're theater artists, but they do try to maintain a certain amount of neutrality as they speak to folks in Laramie. So no matter what is being said to them, they try to treat people politely and with respect and honor what they're saying, even though sometimes they're saying some not so great things. And I think that's really impressive, but it speaks to their ability to be able to communicate with all types of people and to be able to get these interviews out of them, even though they're not trained journalists.
That's a great point. Even if they're not trained journalists, collecting those oral histories are so important just for, the historical record. And as you noted, gathering all kinds of different voices, because there are voices perhaps that we don't necessarily want to hear because they go against, our own ideas and values, but those voices are still important, right? Because we have to understand other people's point of views, we have to hear the voices. We have to understand how they see things too. And that's what dialogue, of course, is all about. So I think verbatim theater offers a really unique approach to doing that. So as the director for this show, how did you approach directing verbatim theater? Is it different in any way from a kind of traditional screenplay?
It was different. A lot of it was individual moments. And so this was a really interesting project where we were combining theater. It was very much a theatrical piece, but then we were having to film it. So we were working with trying to figure out, when do we want to see, we're in the editing process right now. So when do we want to see a wide shot of the stage, reminding us that this is theater? When do we want to zoom in on someone, which of course, normally with theater, you don't have the ability to do.
So you kind of have the best of both worlds, right? Because you were able to do multiple takes, but it's still theater. And then you're able to edit too with some, probably not any CGI effects, but as you say,
No.
wide shot zoom in.
Yes, it's an interesting hybrid situation. And part of the reason I chose the script was because the characters are relatively separate. They're oftentimes being interviewed. And so there are some scenes where we have multiple people talking to each other, but a lot of times it's one person who's talking about their opinion or how they feel. And we could get a lot of kind of close-up shots on them. And we didn't have a dolly. We didn't have, the ability to really smoothly move the camera all around the playing space. So a lot of it is set up as individual shots, that we do this shot, we go in, and then we move to this setup and we go in on these people, and then we're going to edit those things together. So I think that is going to be really effective with the way this script is structured, because the script already lends itself to that. There are certainly scripts that would be much harder, I think, to do that with and have it still make sense as a coherent story. That was one of the things that made me lean toward this for this particular project. And then my directing approach was really sort of what I think of as an Our Town approach. The play Our Town by Thornton Wilder. Very, very open and spare and done with very few props, but we're hearing all these different voices of the people of, in that case, Grover's Corners, New Hampshire. So we hear their different voices and we see a scene here and we see a scene there, but we're very much aware that we're not realistically representing locations. We're sort of on an open playing space. The set is a map of the town of Laramie from an overhead, like bird's eye kind of view, is painted on the floor. And then we have these columns that to me sort of represented kind of a Western kind of aesthetic. They're very dark wood. And yet we almost kind of don't know what this place is. It's not a realistic representation. So the actors are almost kind of floating there in the middle of this non-realistic kind of set in order to give this idea of these overlapping voices all coming into this space and trying to represent a town that is very much Laramie, but it really could be anywhere.
I like that. The set does sound kind of surreal. I look forward to seeing how it looks, but yeah, kind of the Anytown USA, right? That while this story takes place in Laramie, historically, it could be anywhere and has been anywhere, in fact.
Right.
Well, wonderful. I'd love to turn to Kylie and McKenzie. Thank you two so much for joining me today and for taking the time to speak with us about this amazing show. First and foremost, I would love if you would share with our audience a bit more about your theater backgrounds. Kylie, McKenzie, welcome.
Hi, thank you. So I've actually been doing theater since high school. My director kind of just pulled us into it. He was very into Shakespeare, so we did a lot of modernized Shakespeare versions, and which kind of inspired me to continue on through theater in Green Bay, because it's just kind of like my happy place.
I love that. We all need a happy place, right?
So for me, I started theater in middle school when my school had auditions for a play in the spring, and I continued it throughout high school. and I wasn't always doing acting on stage, but I kind of did a little bit of everything. I predominantly did costumes and tech work, and I just loved working in that environment, getting to work with so many people in different ways and just building connections.
Wonderful. Well, a few more questions. So, Kylie, first and foremost, what character did you portray, or will you portray in the Laramie Project? And how did you prepare for that role?
So I actually had 7 different roles that
Oh my goodness.
I think the one that I spent the most time on working with both Rebecca and just like researching myself was Reggie Flutie. She was the responding officer to the scene of Matthew Shepard. So she found him at the fence. She was the officer that responded to the call. And it was really difficult to take in that kind of point of view, to see someone who's normally not used to dealing with that kind of thing, and dealing with both like the shock, the surprise, the remembering the training, all of that someone has to encompass when they're dealing with that sort of thing. I was lucky enough, Rebecca sent me a bunch of different videos of Reggie Flutie, just clips of her talking, her moving around, so I could kind of study like how she is as a person. And I also did additional research into Laramie as a town, and like kind of how the connections there worked.
So in Twilight, for our last discussion, we had Asia and CJ here, who also played numerous roles, and it was just fascinating talking to both of them about how they were able to accomplish that. So for you, how do you approach 7 different roles to be able to, do you keep them separate? Do they talk to one another in your head? It's kind of amazing.
So for myself, I'm a very color-coded organizational person. So my script has multiple different colored sticky notes, different highlights, and I take each character at a time. I will learn one character and move on to the next. It doesn't matter where they're placed in the script, like they're who I focus on. And I start with the smallest character, like the one that doesn't require as much research. And then I'll build on to some of the deeper characters that I put into.
That makes sense. I love the color coded thing. I'm a very hyper organized person myself, so I appreciate that. Well, McKenzie, can you tell us a little bit more about your role in this production? You were the show's dramaturg. Some of our viewers may not be familiar with what dramaturgy is, so if you could enlighten us a little bit about dramaturgy and your role in this production, please.
Yeah, so hopefully I get the general job description down correctly, but it's doing a lot of research to help inform those in the production about like the time period and the characters and just general background. It's reading through the script and doing a bunch of like the background research, so that if anyone were to have a question, you can better inform them and just kind of help the production grow from that perspective.
So it sounds like you're kind of the show historian, right? So you're making sure that people are understanding the time and place and location where this production is actually taking place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's correct.
Very cool. So for both of you, what did you learn by immersing yourself in this story? What did you take away from this experience?
Do you want to go first, Kylie?
Sure.
Okay.
So hard. We're on Zoom. It's hard to like correspond with who's doing that. So I took away a lot from this show. I had a general idea of some of the issues that were happening, not only back then, but now, but to see them kind of come full circle as to what happened and is it still happening in our society. And it created just this level of understanding, I guess. I knew general knowledge, and now that I've gone through the show, I read the dramaturgy packet that was provided for us. It showed me a lot about like what's really happening and how to understand it, because I've never personally experienced it.
And for me, I think my biggest takeaway was kind of a more general thing. And I had mentioned it one of the first rehearsals I sat in on, that like people still hold the views that were held back then. And despite all the progress that we as a society have made, there was still so much more that needs to be done for people to feel safe and equal in our country. And I think just being able to understand like some of the origins of where that comes from, the different legislations that were passed between then and now and are still continuing to be passed and discussed, it shows how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
And you make a great point, actually, that, legislation is amazing, right? To offer for whatever you're talking about, but changing people's hearts, minds, that can be much more difficult, and it takes a lot longer. I mean, legislation takes a long time too, but to change people's minds about these deep-seated, very ingrained ideas is a long struggle. Social justice is not achieved, overnight. It's a very, very long process. So on that note, let's talk about social justice and the arts. For everyone here, how are the visual arts, particularly theater, well suited to exploring issues of social justice?
Well, I can start to address that a little bit. I think that theater.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Is something that gets inside people in a different way and helps to build empathy and concern for other human beings. Thought it was really interesting. It does that for the actors and the designers and the crew and all the people who are involved in the production, because it helps us to see things from other people's points of view. But it probably more importantly even does that for the audience, to help them understand why people feel the way they do. And until you understand why people feel the way they do, I think it's hard to combat that. And even after you understand, it's still difficult to combat it. There is one of the things that I think is really bittersweet about the play is that there are so many people who make what to them you understand are logical sounding arguments as to why they believe what they call the gay lifestyle is wrong. And for those characters and those people that they're based on, you realize that they really do believe that. We do see some examples in the show of characters who change over the course of the show. Characters like Jedediah Schultz, who's a college student and expresses some rather homophobic views at the beginning of the show that he later comes back to at the end and says, I don't know why I ever let this make me think that you were different than I am. And he really seems to feel embarrassed about what he said at the beginning. And so I think we see hope in the younger characters in particular for some sort of change, for some sort of attitude shift. But I think the show ultimately is very bittersweet in that way. It is hopeful. There's a lot of hope. The mere thought of doing the show is hopeful because there are people who want to explore this and want to understand, and that is all an act of hope. And even going to the theater to see it or watching a recorded production is a hopeful act because it's people trying to understand what other people believe. But it's not a real hopeful show in some other respects. I think it acknowledges how much work there is left to do and that it's not going to change overnight. Progress is long and slow. And this play is, I think, a part of that, but it's only a part of that. There's so much more work to be done.
Wonderful. Kylie, McKenzie, any thoughts on the role of theater in promoting issues of social justice?
Yeah, kind of adding on to what Rebecca was saying, theater, especially this piece, shows a lot of hope. It pushes a lot of emotions onto someone, and I think that's the beautiful thing about any theater piece, whether it's like a light and fluffy musical or show where the audience will go away feeling happy, like fulfilled. They're feeling something when they walk out of that theater. With our show, they're walking away and those feelings are still there. They're just different. They're seeing like, wow, this is like a horrible thing that happens. They're feeling some sense of like, change, what can be done, what has been done. And theater isn't just for entertainment. It's not just for fun. It's there to educate people, and it provides a visual way for people to learn, because not everyone learns the same. They don't digest information the same way. And having it visualized in a theatrical form, I think, helps people comprehend what's happening socially in a new way.
I don't really have anything else to add that hasn't been said. You guys pretty much covered it.
Well, McKenzie and Kylie, I'd like to just talk a little bit about who some of your favorite playwrights are and influential plays you've read or studied, and how these playwrights and plays or musicals have informed kind of your exploration of performing arts.
So for me, two of my favorite playwrights would be Thornton Wilder, which was interesting that it was brought up earlier,
Yeah.
and then Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's written In the Heights and Hamilton. In our town, we did my senior year of high school, and it was one of those plays where, like, reading it the first time through, you don't really know where it's gonna go, and you're kind of just like, why are we doing this? But like when you dig into it, it actually is such a deeper meaning about like appreciating even just the little things in life and trying to enjoy every minute of life as it kind of goes through. And you just kind of have this like really deep appreciation for just anything really. It kind of just grows through that. And with Lin-Manuel Miranda, especially within the Heights, it's showing what life is like in Washington Heights, New York, which a lot of people don't really know what that's like. And they have this bias and stereotype of what it is there, but there's so much vibrant culture that goes unnoticed. And it's really interesting to see, and really like, it's just fun to look into.
Kylie, how about you?
Actually, going off of what Kenny said, In the Heights was actually the first show that I saw professionally performed, which kind of changed my mindset. That was my sophomore year of college, which is very weird to think. But in high school, we did a lot of Shakespeare, like I said earlier. So that kind of formed my early on views of theater and how it's done. It was all very modernized Shakespeare, though, so nothing traditional about it in any sense. The first play that really kind of hit home and showed me how deep theater can get was actually when we did Mary Jane by Amy Herzog here. It was a beautiful show about a family just dealing with sickness, illness, and loss. And I think that really instilled into me what theater can truly show other than happiness or culture, but it can show family, loss, love, that kind of thing as well.
That's just absolutely beautifully spoken. And Rebecca, how about for you? Who were your muses or inspirations in your formative years? I assume you were a theater kid growing up, but perhaps not. But at least by graduate school, who were you reading and really admiring?
I did theater in high school, and I did community theater, and then I went and did a BFA and an MFA and a PhD. So a lot of schooling.
Okay, I got the theater kid right on the top.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Growing up and early college, I think I was very much interested in the classics, Shakespeare, Henrik Ibsen, Doll's House. Those, I really loved Ibsen's work.
Hedda Gabler.
Hedda Gabler. Oh, I love Hedda Gabler. Absolutely. And I had a course in college on Ibsen. There was like an honors course that I took that was all Ibsen all semester, and it was fantastic. Then a little later, I started exploring female playwrights, and I really am interested in the work of a playwright named Sarah Rule, who did a play. We did this play at Theater on the Bay in Marinette a couple of years ago, a play called Dead Man's Cell Phone, which is just, she just has an interesting way of exploring things. And then we did her play Eurydice as well. So she's an interesting playwright. I think she explores human relationships in just a fascinating kind of way. So those are some of the big ones for me. And then, you know, there's kind of a laundry list. Tracy Letts, who wrote a play called August Osage County, really, really good, really dark play, but really good. Eugene O'Neill, of course.
Morning Becomes Electra.
Yeah. Mhm.
Well, I love origin stories. So it's really fun to hear from all of you, your muses and inspirations. I think that's awesome to learn. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for joining me for this amazing discussion. I have one final question. I'd like us to conclude by looking both backwards and forwards. So where are we today as a society concerning the issues that are raised by the Laramie Project? What has changed since Matthew Shepard's death in 1998, and what work remains yet to be done?
I think transgender rights are coming to the forefront now, and the trans community is often the victim of violence. And that has been ignored for far too long, and they haven't been accepted. We need more exploration of that and problem solving around trans rights. I think more acceptance and open doors in society for that community. There have been hate crimes bills passed. I think there's a deeper understanding of why it's important to pass hate crimes legislation and what a hate crime is, and the effect it has not just on the people who were directly affected, but on the entire group that was a target of the hate crime. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more hate crimes, but I think people are starting to understand. In 1998, I think there was a lot of sort of that idea of, why do we need this type of legislation if you murder is murder, and we don't need to make this a different thing. We already have laws in place. But I think now there's more of an understanding that it really is a different type of crime. Unfortunately, Wyoming just voted down, or failed anyway, a hate crimes legislation bill. And so they are one of only 3 states in the nation that doesn't have hate crimes legislation. So there's been quite a bit of resistance there, I think.
Without question.
A lot of progress has been made as well. So.
Kylie, McKenzie, any thoughts to add?
Yeah. So when speaking with Alan, I was actually doing an additional project on both of these shows for another class of mine. He was talking and he brought up the quote, "Why can't we all just get along?" And that really resonated with me, with the fact of the discussion surrounding it, because why can't we just get along? Well, it's a great idea. People don't have the understanding, respect, and trust between one another for that to come true. Who is we? Why is why? There's all of these deeper questions that we have to ask before we ourselves as a society can ask that question. I do know that I think myself am a little bit blind to what's been happening in the entire world until I started this show, because we're on a campus that's in one of like the top 5 or top 10 for LGBTQ like inclusion, like promotion and that kind of thing. We're one of the safer campuses on that scale. Where I was from, it just was like very similar concept to Laramie. A lot of old people, a lot of old idealistic views. So until coming to school, until doing this show, I never really realized not much has been done. People like to think there is. They highlight the small things, and the small steps are great, but there needs to be more.
As you mentioned earlier, you can't change people's hearts. Like, you can put all these rules into place, but people are still going to view other human beings as less than that. And as awful as that is, that like sounds, and that is, it's still one of those things that we as a society need to realize, that everybody is a human being and everyone deserves to be treated as such and treated equally, given the same amount of respect, no matter what. And with trans rights, the NCAA has recognized that trans people should be able to play on teams that they identify as, when other sports leagues have failed to do so in the past and are still currently denying to do so. And all these different legislations that are in the works right now but it's still like, as a society, we've such a long way to go, and just realizing that other people are just as human as we are.
Well, thank you all so much, Rebecca, McKenzie, Kylie. You've added amazing insights and thoughts and analysis that I truly believe will add great depth to the viewers' experience. So thank you so much for taking time to participate in this panel discussion. So for those of you who have already seen the Laramie Project, we do hope that you enjoyed the show. For those of you who are watching the panel discussion beforehand, we hope that you enjoyed the show. My name's Eric Morgan, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies and History at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Thank you so much for joining our panel discussion, and enjoy the Laramie Project.